the final workshop of day one. I hope you've all had a great day. It's nice to see some familiar faces from both earlier today as well as yesterday. I was here yesterday along with some other presenters doing a day-long institute. So this is my third workshop in a almost less than, well, yeah, a 24-hour period at this point, right? So today, I should probably check to see what we're doing. Grammar, okay, right. So today what we're gonna do is we're gonna be thinking about grammar. I think the theme so perfectly articulates what we're gonna be doing here today. The theme of this conference is from the what to the how. We're not gonna be talking about the what of grammar. I think grammar is one of those things that there's always somebody that knows more than you. And there's ways in which you can learn about the rules of grammar that I feel like are certainly important as a professional, but I think what's most important for us to focus on are the ways in which we can teach students how to use grammar in their writing to become more powerful. So what that means is we're going to be really thinking about methods. So allow me to introduce myself and then we're going to get started. My name is Steve Sell. I work with the Reading and Writing Project, which is based out of Teachers College, Columbia University in New York City. I taught middle school primarily for 12 years in New York City. And I now, over the last few years, have had the pleasure of working with students and teachers across the globe and supporting them with their reading and writing work. About 7 years ago, I was teaching at a school in Brooklyn, New York. And if you're familiar just in general with New York City or with Brooklyn, you know that there's people from all over the world that come to New York City. In my classroom, I had students from countries in South America, Central America, parts of Asia, and all across the Middle East. And one year I had a student who I first taught in 7th grade and then later in 8th grade as well, named Hamza from Yemen. And he spoke very little English. He had the best smile of any student in my class every morning, was so happy and excited to come in to class every day. And when it came time to write, he really, really struggled. But around, I think, January, we started our poetry unit. And lo and behold, Hamza was the best poet by far in my class. His poetry was so good that my wife, who at that time was my girlfriend, I would bring his poems home and read them to her, wishing that I had written them. I mean, these were beautiful, in some cases, love letters that this 12-year-old was writing. Many of them inspired by poems that we were reading in class, but many of the poems he was writing were poems that came from what he was feeling and experiencing as a 12-year-old who had just come from Yemen. And just a little bit of background about what was going on in his life, he moved to the United States to live and work with his father, who owned a store, a small store in Brooklyn. But meanwhile, his whole family, the rest of his family, his mother included, were all back in Yemen. So much of the poetry that he was able to write about was about that, about missing his family, about missing his mother, and the love that he had for his family. And there was so much beauty and power in this poetry that he produced that I know as his teacher, it gave me so much hope for what we were going to be able to do for the rest of the year. Because for the first time, I was really able to recognize that he was a powerful writer. Because before that time, I was stuck in this mindset that if I didn't see things written down perfectly in complete sentences or spelled correctly, that he was not a powerful writer. And his poetry is poetry that I've kept to this day. You know how some of you, if you move from one house to the next, you keep a little box of notebooks, things that you've written, or as a teacher, you kind of collect student work that you always want to have. Hamza's books of poetry are books that I always keep with me and will cherish for the rest of my life because it's some of the most beautiful and clear writing that I've ever seen. So today, we're going to be thinking about methods. And I hope that by the end of today, you're going to be able to leave with some ideas that you can bring into your classrooms and into your schools. Before we begin, I want to start with us thinking through the importance of grammar in our lives, of course, why it's important to teach grammar. But I also want to think about some of the complexity that comes with thinking about grammar as a writer. Because sometimes it can be debilitating to sit down and try to write if you're stuck with thinking about the rules that you have to keep in mind. And I think there's 3 really funny and insightful quotes here. And what I'd like you to do is to just take a look at these quotes. I'm going to read them aloud for you. And after I read them aloud, I'm going to just ask that you turn and talk with the person next to you and just think about one quote that maybe resonates with you that you can make a connection with when it comes to you thinking about the teaching of grammar. Our English teacher demanded, "But you've had lessons in grammar." We all looked shifty. English grammar was something we felt we were expected to infer from our reading. "Grammar is my enemy." You maybe have heard students say that. "The defense of language is too large a matter to be left to the properly qualified." So just turn and talk with someone near you and just think about one of these quotes and how it maybe resonates with your experience of teaching grammar in your classroom. Okay. So I'm going to have you do one more turn and talk before we really launch into our work today. I find that with any work I'm doing with teachers, whether it's grammar or earlier today partner talk, that we all come with some different lenses, some different questions that we have on our minds that we want to think through and help support our students, or maybe even if you're a coach, the teachers that you work with. So what I'd like you to do is to just take a look at these questions. I'm going to read them aloud, and I'm going to just give you a minute to just think through a question that you think you'd consider to be a burning question for you when it comes to the teaching of grammar or supporting your students in their work as becoming more powerful writers. So the first one is, how do I support students' understanding of grammar as a form of power in school and the world? How do I develop grammar instruction so as not to encroach on workshop teaching, but still make it transferable? How do I build upon what my students can already do instead of only looking at what they cannot? And how do I utilize methods that enable my students to gain access to the joy and power of becoming a writer? So just pick one of those questions that you feel like is most important to you. I think they're all important questions, we'd agree, but just pick one that's most important to you and the community of students and learners that you're working with, and then turn and talk about some of the thoughts that you have going into our work today. Okay, so let's come back together. And at the end of today, we're going to revisit those questions again and just think about if there's some ways in which your thinking has changed from the beginning to the end. So we're going to start by just thinking through a little bit about how we can use grammar to actually build more powerful writers, not just teach the rules and conventions of grammar. Of course, that's important, but we also want to make sure that we're building more powerful writers in our classrooms. And what I want us to start thinking a little bit about is what makes a powerful writer. It's a pretty broad concept. And I'm going to ask you to just turn and talk to the people next to you and just share some quick thoughts. And I'm just going to give you about a minute to do this. So just anything that comes to your mind when you think of what makes a powerful writer. Okay, so let's come back together. So as you just started to talk through this, you can see this is a conversation you could have for many more minutes and many more days. And if you've worked in schools that were anything like mine, we talked about this constantly. What makes powerful writing? And there's lots of ideas out there. I'm going to posit one today in connection to grammar work that I think is important. So when we're thinking about powerful writing in terms of grammar, what we're thinking about is that it has meaning, and we can see that and hear that in the writing, that there's beauty to the writing, there's clarity, and there's accuracy. So that's what we're thinking of when we're teaching grammar. We're trying to make sure that our students are able to use grammar to do those 4 things. There's other important qualities to writing, of course. So skills, for example, that we want to teach kids, like how to organize their writing, how to use transitions, how to elaborate. Those are important qualities of writing. But for right now, when it comes to grammar, these are the few that we're going to be thinking about. And I'm going to have us practice this by reading a very short love letter. Not written by me. Not by Hamza. We can pretend it was by Hamza. I'm going to read this, and the first thing I want us to think about is just looking at end punctuation, all right? And here's what I'd like you to do. The first time through, I'm going to read it aloud, and I want you to just notice where you see end punctuation in this letter. Dear Jack, I want a man who knows what love is all about. You are generous, kind, thoughtful. People who are not like you admit to being useless and inferior. You have ruined me for other men. I yearn for you. I have no feelings whatsoever when we're apart. I can be forever happy. Will you let me be yours, Jill? So I asked you to just notice where you see end punctuation, and we can clearly see we have at the end of every sentence a period, and we have a question mark at the very end. So now what I want you to do is with your partner, think about if you were to revise this love letter, if you were Jill, how could you change the end punctuation in here? And how would that maybe change the meaning of the letter even, or the beauty, or the clarity? So think about ways in which you could change end punctuation, and just turn and talk about that with your partner, and I'll show you an example of how I did that. Okay. So let's take a look at this revision, all right? And some of you came up with some really creative ideas. So let's listen to this version of the love letter. Dear Jack, I want a man who knows what love is. All about you are generous, kind, thoughtful people who are not like you. Admit to being useless and inferior. You have ruined me. For other men I yearn. For you I have no feelings whatsoever. When we're apart, I can be forever happy. Will you let me be? So think about comparing the differences in terms of how end punctuation is used in this and how that changes the meaning and clarity. So of course we can change around some words, but we can also use end punctuation to even change meaning and to change clarity and to change the beauty of a letter. So I want you to just turn and talk and think about these different qualities in the students' writing that you see every day. And that could be students that you work with every day, or the students that you're supporting other teachers who are working with every day. Think about where your students are with these four qualities. So where do you feel like they're the strongest, and where do you feel like they need the most work? So just discuss that with the people next to you. Turn and talk. So we're going to now shift gears here and get into thinking about the stages of acquisition when it comes to the teaching of grammar. We need to keep in mind that our kids are going to be at different levels in terms of how they're acquiring the rules and conventions of English. And there's 5 things to keep in mind here. So when it comes to the stages, when we're reading, and we're going to get some practice with this, when we're reading students' work, or even when we're listening to them speak, what we want to pay attention to is what stage of acquisition are they in as a writer or a speaker. So for some of our students, you're going to notice recognition is a stage that they're in. So that means in writing, you might see that they're trying to use an end punctuation, but they maybe only put one period in the entire piece of writing. But they're recognizing that end punctuation exists. They know that they need it. Approximation, a great example that I used to see in my writers' work all the time is you teach them how to use apostrophes, and you see apostrophes everywhere. Every time there's an S, there's an apostrophe, right? That's an example, classic example of approximation, right? They're overusing it. Right? They think they should be using it, but they're not, or they know that they should be using it, but they're not using it correctly. But they're approximating. They're getting close. That's what we mean by approximation. And then we have mastery, and we all know what that means, right? So the students who really have mastery of something like apostrophes or commas or sentence structure. And then there's slippage. So I think most adults, we could sort of consider that we fall into this category. Sometimes I make mistakes with end punctuation. Sometimes I make mistakes with apostrophes, but I can go back and I can correct it, right? So we slip up. Some people call that your typo. And then there's issues around code switching. And that's a stage of acquisition. And code switching is something that I think is really important for us to spend a little bit of time thinking about. So here's a quick definition for code switching. And the reason that I think this is significant is in today's world where digital media is a huge part of our students' lives, and they're using that to write more than ever, one of the great things is they're writing a lot. However, the kind of writing they're doing on Facebook or on Twitter or in emails or whatever sort of social media they're using to communicate is not the same sort of code that they want to be using in schools. It's more casual. So when we're teaching code switching, and when we recognize that students are at that stage, what we're noticing is they're using casual language. So what we want to teach them is how and why to switch. So they need to understand that when they're in school, that's an academic setting. So they need to switch the way in which they're speaking to a more academic tone. I'm going to give you a quick example here. And as we're reading this, I want you to think through anytime you see an example of this student struggling with code switching. I seen two kids named Herbie and Justice. It was a few years ago in 3rd grade. It was the first day of school. I didn't know no one. It was lunchtime. We all go downstairs to the lunchroom. We all ate. I ate by myself because I didn't know no one at that time. So, double negatives, code switching. A lot of times kids use that in their conversations, but it's not slippage. They're intentionally doing that because that is a way that people talk to each other in a more casual setting. So it's not slippage. That stage would be code switching. So that student needs to know that maybe that's the way they're going to talk with their friends outside of school. They might even use that on Facebook. But we need to teach them that a double negative is something you don't want to have in writing. You need to switch the way in which you're using that. So that's just one example of code switching. So what I want to do, in staying on with code switching here, is I want to make a chart, and this is something that I would do with my students. I'm going to make a quick T-chart, and we're going to list out some examples of casual terms that we hear every day or we read our students writing every day, and we're going to think about how we can switch those. So this is something that when I'm teaching code switching to students that I do as a first activity. So one column I have casual. On the other, we're going to be translating or switching to academic. I'll give you a real easy one to start with. LOL, all right? Right? Kids use that all the time. They use it in their essays or even their stories that they're writing. Laugh out loud, right? Ain't. My parents used to get so upset at me when I used that, right? So, ain't, we hear that a lot. I am not. So that's one way to switch that. So, another good example, right? We drop letters. Oftentimes in casual language, we drop letters. Our students do that a lot. I mean, even I do that all the time too. I have a lot of family in the United States that's from the South, and that's a big part of the way you talk when you're from the South. In English, they have a completely different way of talking, right? They drop lots of letters all the time at the end, at the beginning, sometimes in the middle of words. It can be hard to understand people from the Southern United States. So, you know, they may say something like nothing, right? So they're dropping the G. And what I just did there, we wouldn't even probably see that in writing. I actually punctuated it correctly. I put the apostrophe at the end. We know that's one way we can use an apostrophe. When we see our students doing this, they'll just have that, right? If they do have the apostrophe there, we could say, well, they're using that rule correctly, right? They're using apostrophes correctly. So this is a really great activity to do with students, and you can see this could go on and on and on. What I would suggest is that if you do this, you give them a few examples to start with, and then give them a copy of some writing where there's examples of casual language all over it, and have them do some code switching. And then another great thing you can have them do, they love this, is give a homework assignment where they have to keep track of all the examples of other casual terms or phrases that they hear, and be able to come into class with those terms switched. And then you can have them share that with their partner, or you could do a whole class share and continue adding to this chart. The idea here is that you want them constantly paying attention to this. Because if you have lots of students, and I'm assuming you do because, as I mentioned, social media sort of forces them into the casual world, lots of students struggling with that stage of acquisition with code switching, you want to make sure that you're having them become aware of this as a both reader and also in terms of how they're doing their writing. So I want to give you a second to just turn and talk through code switching and think through whether that seems to be for you and your community a significant stage of acquisition that you want to focus on with students. So turn and talk about that with your partners. So let's come back together. So just having a really, really great conversation, just listening into a partnership. When it comes to the stages of acquisition, if you're thinking about English language learners, which many of you probably are thinking about because that may be the students that you're teaching, for many of our English language learners, first of all the research shows that it's important that they're building up their ability to speak and write in their native language, to become more fluent in that native language. It will also then pay dividends when they're trying to learn any other languages, right? So that's one thing we want to make sure we're keeping in mind. So if you're noticing issues in their native language, they're going to happen in the new language that they're learning, in this case, English. For many English language learners, they're most likely going to be in a stage of acquisition they're going to be in approximation. That will be the stage of acquisition that most of your students will be in. And if you think about for yourselves with any new language or second language or third language or fourth language, many of you maybe speak 5 languages in here, which is incredible. With any new language you learn, you stay in that stage for, in some cases, forever, approximation. And I think about that. I speak Spanish pretty well. I'm not a native speaker, but I'm always in that stage of approximation. I'm always doing things just because they're safe. I'm using phrases. I'm staying with sort of syntactical structures that I'm comfortable with, and I'm using them in the wrong context just because I'm comfortable with them, right? And if you think about your students, and this is something to sort of take away from today, is when you're looking at their writing, just think about whether you notice them doing that, and it might be because they just feel comfortable and safe doing that, and that's why they're doing it, because they're approximating. They're trying it out, and they're going to keep trying and keep trying. So we need to make sure we're coaching students out of that. But the other piece that's important, and this would be a whole other workshop, so I'm just going to say this again, is making sure that in their native language, you're building their skills with grammar in that language as well. So in this case, Arabic, that they're building their skills there, that they're getting comfortable and becoming fluent as writers and readers and speakers. Because you can build off of that work when you're trying to teach them in English or really in any other language. So I want us to take a look at some student work right now. And these are just 2 examples. One here is from a 7th grade student's writing notebook. And what I want us to do is to just think about the stage of acquisition that we think this writer might be in. They could be in more than one, but the one that they're in the most so far. So I'll read it aloud for you. So this is 7th grade students writing. The first day I went to a pet shop, I was only 7. In my mom's eyes, that's old enough to have a pet. So I walk in, this huge guy comes up to me and says, "Hey, little fella." "Hi," I said in a squeaky voice. What do you want today?" "Something," I replied. My mom said, "He wants something that walks and can fit in his tank." We walk down a huge hall. I look up and see cages, fish, dogs, and there it was, a little itty-bitty iguana. The way he moved his head made me laugh. The guy say, "Is that what you want?" "Yes," I said. My mom said, "We'll take it." I start jumping with joy. He bring it down. I started to pick it up. We went home and put it in the tank. So I want to say this, keep in mind this is a notebook entry, right? It's a notebook entry. I want to go back to our stages of acquisition. Where do you think he is right now? What stage do you think he'd be in the most so far, just looking at that one notebook entry? Which stage? So just turn and talk with your partners about that. Okay, so in looking at this writer, we can see that because it's a notebook entry, my lens would be any spelling mistakes, they could be spelling issues that in a final draft, if this was a personal narrative he was going to write, that maybe would be cleaned up. So they might be slippage. So that means like he could know how to spell replied. It could just be that he made a little mistake there. He put the E in the wrong place. What I'm noticing is a lot of approximation. Like right away, I already gave this as an example. You can see with the apostrophes, right? That's a great example. We see that all the time. So he's approximating. And I see lots more examples of that. So this writer, because one thing he's doing well, if I were to talk to this writer, is he is almost punctuating dialogue correctly. That's another example of approximation. But he doesn't know how to punctuate his dialogue. And that's a huge next step for kids. The first step is just have the quotation marks there, right? And put them at the beginning and at the end of the dialogue. From there, students are going to need to learn how to punctuate the dialogue, where to put the period, where to put the comma, or the end punctuation that they might have at the end of that dialogue. So when we're studying student work, and it can even be a short notebook entry like that, we can identify what stage of acquisition they're in, and that can help us give them feedback. So if I'm working with this writer, one thing I would say is, I know that we learned how to use apostrophes already, and I noticed that you use it correctly when you were trying to show possession here, your mom's eyes, but you know what? We don't need it on eyes. That's just plural. That's just a plural word. You just have to have S at the end. You don't have to have an apostrophe anytime you see S. So another thing to think about when we're looking at student work and when we're listening to their speech is that there are some grammar issues that are audible and inaudible. So inaudible issues are ones that can appear in their writing, but we don't hear. So an example would be apostrophes, homophones, spelling errors. So those are things that we see in their writing. We can't hear them when they're speaking. We don't hear a student misspell a word. Let's take a look at this. We already identified apostrophes. I know I already read it aloud to you, so you had that experience. I want you to just take a look at this and think, what are some other possible inaudible issues in this writing? So there's the inaudible, and then we have the audible, and we kind of already focused on code switching. When we're thinking about code switching, we're really thinking about the things that we hear students saying, not necessarily what we're seeing on the page. So some examples of audible issues would be subject-verb agreement, double negatives, I seen. It's a great example of one we hear a lot. And then verb tense issues. So those are ones that you can hear, but you don't necessarily always see those on the page. Sometimes you will, but you're definitely going to always hear them. And so it could be that students are not code switching. And grammar is not just about writing. If you were with me earlier this afternoon, we did a session on partner talk, and one of the things that I said would be a predictable challenge with partner talk is the academic language happening in those partnerships. So one thing you can give students feedback on is any audible issues that you hear when they're turning and talking. And just making that clear to students that that's one thing that you're thinking about when you talk about academic language. Not just using big words, right? But also thinking about grammar and conventions. So I think that the reason that I put this up here is I think it's important for you to let your kids know about this idea of audible versus inaudible. It's a part of building a community where your students feel like they have more power as a writer. And since grammar is more than just writing, of course, they need to know that there's things that they're going to hear out loud from other people, from themselves, and there's things that aren't always going to be clear in their writing that are issues in their grammar. So I think it's worthwhile, just like I was saying with doing a little work with code switching, to also have your students be able to do this work of identifying the difference between audible and inaudible. Because it opens up the possibilities of what you can teach students. When we get into the methods, you'll see that there's so many different methods that you can be using to teach so many different issues that you have coming up in your classroom. So we're going to get into methods and get some practice with some teaching methods that we can use to teach grammar. But before we do that, I want you to just turn and talk and think about one or two takeaways from our session here so far. So just turn and talk about those with your partner. You may want to jot something down so that you don't forget it by the end of the day together. So just think about one or two takeaways. All right, so there's a few methods that I want to define real quick. There's 3 different ways that, for me, have been really effective methods for teaching grammar. So one would be direct teaching, so a mini lesson. Right, that's an example of direct teaching. Another would be doing some inquiry work, and another is teaching students to develop this idea of apprenticeship. So you all know what direct teaching is, so I want to and inquiry as well. We're going to get practice with all of these. Apprenticeship is when we have students use other writers as a mentor. So they become an apprentice as a writer. So when they're reading, they're paying attention to how the writer uses certain rules in grammar. So it could be, just to go back to something we've already talked about, end punctuation. And so their job is, as they're reading, to be an apprentice, to really admire that in the writing that they're reading. And that's a way, obviously, to get them more engaged in the text that they're choosing to read or that you're having them read. But it's also one very powerful method for us to teach grammar without always being there. Letting your kids know that you can learn by reading the way that other people structure sentences or stories or essays. Because we want to make sure that we're building independence. Direct teaching, while we do build towards independence, is us guiding them towards something. Inquiry, while inquiry is much more open-ended, inquiry is still us leading them to think through something. Apprenticeship helps them develop this idea that it's not just the teacher that can teach me this. Any book can teach me grammar. Any book I pick up, any essay I pick up, I can be paying attention to grammar. All right, we're going to get some practice here first with direct teaching. So this would be a quick mini lesson that you could teach students if you wanted to show them, after they've written a draft, how they can change end punctuation, or even if they want to add a new sentence, how they can consider end punctuation when they're making revisions. So I'm going to have you pretend, this is a short vignette from a personal narrative. I'm going to have you pretend that you're my writing class. And what I'm going to be trying to do here is, we're in revision, kind of thinking about editing as well. We're going to be thinking through how we might improve what I have thus far. All right, so class, so I have this story that I've been working on, like many of you. And today, I want to teach you that when I revise, I know that I have to kind of think through making sure that I slow down the moment and really add as much detail as possible. And I also know that when I start to do that, that sometimes end punctuation can help me. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to read through what I have so far, and I'm going to show you a few sentences that I'm thinking about adding into my draft that might help slow down the moment I remember when I was in 6th grade, it was so important to have an alligator shirt, the real thing, a locust, with a little alligator on the left breast. And you could only get them at one store in our town. This store was called Papagallo. That was much more expensive than JCPenney and much, much more expensive than Sears or Kmart. And the shirts were $65, which was a lot for a short sleeve cotton shirt. I'm sure there were kids in my school who didn't wear alligator shirts and maybe didn't even care about alligator shirts, but I didn't know any in the group of kids who I thought of as friends. It seemed very important to have one, at least. My mom brought a shirt home for me one night from Sears, but it had an elephant on the pocket, and she couldn't understand why I feigned a smile and took the shirt into my room. I didn't wear the shirt with the elephant, but I heard someone making fun in the cafeteria of kids who had fake shirts, and how if you couldn't have the real thing, you shouldn't try to pretend to be rich. All the kids at the table agreed those shirts were for losers. That weekend, in the Papagallo, in the little dressing room, I tried on one of those locust shirts, which we couldn't afford. There was no way we had money for it, and I ripped off the alligator and the label and put them in my pocket. And then I took them home and sewed them on the shirt my mom had given me. So the first thing I want you to do for me, there's a lot I need to improve in this. It's just a notebook entry. Turn and talk and just think about a place in this story where you think I should slow down and give the reader a little bit more detail. So just turn and talk about that first. We're not thinking about grammar. Just turn and talk about a place I could slow this down and add more detail. Okay, so I hear you giving me a lot of great feedback, and I think I'm going to take all this into consideration. Some of you were talking about like when my mom gave me the shirt, that I could slow that down. Maybe I could like show my reaction. Maybe I could even add some dialogue to that part. When I'm sitting with the kids or when I'm in the cafeteria, sort of describing that more. But the part I'm going to focus on here, because this is always important in narrative writing, is like thinking about like the big moment in the story. And to me, it doesn't come until the very, very end, right? So at the end, when I take that label off, I just say that it happened. So I've drafted a few sentences here that I might add in to just give a little bit more depth. But what you're going to notice is that I've played around with the punctuation a little bit. Can you turn and talk with your partner? And I want you to decide together which sentence you think works the best, considering the tone of the story so far. Okay, so I'm going to break out of the lesson here, and I just want to talk about what I just did. First of all, one of the things that will happen if you do this with your students, right, and this probably would happen right now, is that kids will get really attached to what they think is the best sentence, and if you don't choose theirs, they're going to get really upset, right? And I'm sure if I chose one right now that you do disagree with, you might just walk out of the room, right? So I'm not going to get into that conversation. These are all good sentences. I want to think about the practice, like the method I was using. So I'm teaching revision and I'm also teaching grammar at the same time. So the kids don't feel like, oh, I'm sitting through a grammar lesson right now, right? I'm teaching them how to add something to a narrative, and I'm showing them how punctuation actually helps them write more powerfully. If you're looking at these sentences, you see that there's variations on using commas, the different types of end punctuation. So I'm teaching kids how to use commas in different ways and how that affects the power of a piece of writing and how end punctuation can impact the power of your writing. So this is a great thing to build into if you do writing workshop, and that means that you're doing writing along with your students. It's a great way to build grammar work across the writing process. When you're drafting, when you're writing in your notebook, showing them how you can revise and use grammar to help writing make your work more powerful. So we're going to get into thinking about another method that many of you might use, and it's probably one of my favorite methods to use when it comes to grammar instruction, and that is inquiry. So there's lots of ways in which we can use this method in our classrooms. So to do this, I'm going to be reading aloud a short story. I mentioned already this idea that we want our kids to be able to learn from other writers, and a great way to do this is through read-alouds that we have in our class. So we're going to read this very short story, and some people consider it a prose poem. Some people consider it just a straight old short story. The first thing we're going to do is just think about how the writer uses dialogue. So what we notice about that. And we're just going to look at the first couple of paragraphs to help us figure that out. You're also going to get to hear me try to speak Arabic a little bit, okay? Wandering around the Albuquerque airport terminal, after learning my flight had been delayed for 4 hours, I heard an announcement. If anyone in the vicinity of gate A4 understands any Arabic, please come to the gate immediately. Well, one pauses these days. Gate A4 was my own gate. I went there. An older woman in full traditional Palestinian embroidered dress, just like my grandma wore, was crumbled to the floor, wailing loudly. "Help," said the flight service person. "Talk to her. What is her problem? We told her the flight was going to be late, and she did this." I stooped to put my arm around the woman and spoke to her haltingly. "Shadawa, shabiduk." Just let me approximate. Not even approximate, okay? Habiti. Okay. Somebody else want to read this part? No, I'm just kidding. I got it. Stani shwa min fadlik shubit siwi. So I know, here's what I know what this means. I already asked the translator earlier. She's just laughing at me. I told her she was going to do that. I know she's asking more or less like, what's wrong? What's your problem? Is everything okay? But she's being very nice and respectful, all right? She's not like, what's wrong with you? What's your problem? The minute she heard any word she knew, however poorly used, she stopped crying. She thought the flight had been canceled entirely. She needed to be in El Paso for major medical treatment the next day. I said, "No, we're fine. You'll get there just later." "Who is picking you up?" "Let's call him." All right, so we're thinking about just the dialogue here because there's quite a bit of dialogue in this first part. So first, I want you to just think about how the dialogue really helps, like the quality of this writing, like the power of the writing, the clarity, the beauty, the meaning, any of those things. So turn and talk about that first with your partner. Okay, so the next thing I want you to do is, in the dialogue here, there's lots of examples of dialogue. Can you just now think about how the writer is punctuating dialogue, like some of the differences you see in the punctuation of the dialogue? So turn and talk about that. Any differences you see in how the dialogue is punctuated? So what I might do now, if you were my class, is I might make a quick chart with you. So I might have a chart up here that says, how do we punctuate dialogue? Or when do writers punctuate dialogue? And based off of what you've just talked about, I'll just make a quick list of the things you noticed about how we punctuate dialogue. And just make a quick chart there. An informal chart that can just put back on the page some of the things that you were sharing with your partners. So that's one example of how you can teach how to punctuate dialogue by having them do a little bit of inquiry work. We're going to continue reading, but we're going to switch our lens to thinking about the use of end punctuation. I promise I won't try to speak any more Arabic. I'm really sorry for that. That was not good. "We called her son and I spoke with him in English. I told him I would stay with his mother till we got on the plane and would ride next to her, southwest. She talked to him. Then we called her other sons just for the fun of it. Then we called my dad and he and she spoke for a while in Arabic and found out, of course, they had 10 shared friends. Then I thought, just for the heck of it, why not call some Palestinian poets I know and let them chat with her? This all took up about 2 hours. She was laughing a lot by then, telling about her life, patting my knee, answering questions. She had pulled a sack of homemade mamul cookies, little powdered sugar crumbly mounds stuffed with dates and nuts, out of her bag, and was offering them to all the women at the gate. I just want to stop for a second. You could see how if I'd never introduced how to use like a hyphen, this would be a great way to do that for kids. Like when you can use that in the midst of a sentence. You can see how she's using that. And that would be something that your students would probably not have ever tried out before. But I think this is a great example of a way in which you can use it to add real dramatic effect, to also explain more detail or almost add like a positive in your sentence. To my amazement, not a single woman declined one. It was like a sacrament. The traveler from Argentina, the mom from California, the lovely woman from Laredo. We were all covered with the same powdered sugar and smiling. There is no better cookie. And then the airline broke out free beverages from huge coolers, and 2 little girls from our flight ran around serving us all apple juice, and they were covered with powdered sugar too. And I noticed my new best friend, by now we were holding hands, had a potted plant poking out of her bag, some medicinal thing with green furry leaves. Such an old country tradition. Always carry a plant, always stay rooted to somewhere. And I looked around the gate of late and weary ones, and I thought, this is the world I want to live in. The shared world, not a single person in that gate. Once the crying of confusion stopped, seemed apprehensive about any other person. They took the cookies. I wanted to hug all those other women too. This can still happen anywhere. Not everything is lost. So it's a great story. I wanted to keep reading it just because I wanted you to hear the whole story. I recommend reading this aloud to your kids. It's a wonderful story. But we're just thinking about punctuation here. And I mentioned end punctuation, but you can think about any other forms of punctuation you see this writer using and how they seem to be using it. So just turn and talk about that with your partners. Okay, so this is another example of doing inquiry work, but this is a better example with apprenticeship. One thing you can do if you have kids reading every day in independent reading is you can have them keep track. You could have them assign themselves or set a goal of what they want to keep track of. So maybe I want my students to pay attention as they're reading to words with apostrophes. And I'm going to have them just, not as they read, fill out every time they see an apostrophe, but at the end, just kind of go back and get a couple examples of a sentence that had a word or some words with an apostrophe, and most important, why they think it's there and what does it mean? Like, why is the writer doing that? So that's something that they could do with any new things that you're teaching them in relation to grammar. So it could be within work that you've done with them around how to use commas. It could be end punctuation. You could do it with spelling as well. So you can have them being apprentices and actually keeping track of what they're learning from their mentors. And this is something that you would do if you have them working and reading notebooks. You would have them keep this in their reader's notebook. So you can see I just skipped over a quick slide, but in the interest of time, I was going to have you write a quick anecdote, but I don't think we have enough time for that. So we're going to pretend that you did, right? And this is another form of inquiry work. And the reason I was going to have you do a real short quick write is so you could practice doing this. But I'm just going to talk you through it instead. It's pretty straightforward, so you should be able to imagine how this might work. This is another great method in terms of inquiry. If you do any kind of centers work in your classroom, content area teachers do learning centers often. And if you haven't, I think it's something you want to sort of think about as taking back into your classroom. So a center would be, or centers work really involves just setting up different centers in your classroom. So I want you to imagine that there's 4 different centers in the room here. And it could be that you've put this on a big piece of chart paper for the kids. And they're going to move around from center to center at your direction with their notebooks or with their drafts. It depends on where they are in the process. And so this center is all designed around teaching kids to add commas or play around with where they're using commas, or if they haven't used commas, how they can use commas. So what you do is, this is one task, one example, that one way we use commas is to separate items in a list. So what you're going to have them do is look at the quick example, and then after that, look at something in their writing and think, is there a way that they could do this? So this is using commas in a list. And some of them are going to be like, oh yeah, I see a sentence right here where I could maybe not have a period there, and I can extend it out and be listing out what I'm trying to say there and use commas that way. Here are a few other centers that you could have. You could have them think about, and this is going to be a big one for your kids, especially if you're doing narrative work, how to use commas correctly and quotation marks. So again, at that center, they would go up there, they would read the quick direction. So it says if the quote comes before the person who spoke, place a comma after the quote, before the closing question mark. They could do some quick revision of their writing or quick editing work on their writing where they look at their dialogue and think, okay, Do I need to add a comma? Did I punctuate that correctly? And then they would move on to the next center. So this is another one where it's an example of punctuation around quotation marks. If the quote comes after the person who spoke and tells something, place the comma after the person who spoke before the opening quotation mark. So that's another example where if they have dialogue, they can go and try to think about whether or not they punctuated it correctly and if they need to add it in. So this last one here is how to locate, is the authors, they're going to be looking at more studying the example and thinking how the author has used a comma. And the direction there at the very bottom, then go back to your story and apply some of what you've learned from your mentor author to your draft. That's something that you're going to want them to do at the very end, go back and just study the whole story that they have written over again and think about what they've gathered and learned from each of the different centers. You could put that same direction at the end of each task so they know clearly what they have to do. But that's really just reminding them that the goal is not to just look at the center and read how the writers use commas, but think, okay, how can I actually transfer this into my own writing? So this kind of center or inquiry work is something you can do with any new rule or any rules that your students are working on in their writing. And center work is something you can do in a variety of contexts in your classroom. You can do it when you're teaching, if you're teaching older students, if you're teaching them symbolism, you can have different centers set up in the room of different examples of symbolism in literature to sort of teach them the different ways in which writers use symbols. And that would be a way to have them thinking about transferring that into their own either writing or into their own reading work. But the goal of centers is that it's not just you directing them. It's not always that you're going to teach the mini lesson and use maybe your writing or someone else's writing and guide them towards one direction. You're creating a more student-centered environment for the students, and also you're allowing yourself to go and give feedback and coach into students that might be struggling. If you have students moving around in small groups, you can have small groups of students that maybe you're going to track more closely. And as they're moving around the room, you're going to stay with them and give them some feedback, because you can imagine for some of your students, they might really struggle with this. So you're going to need to be maybe more heavy-handed with some groups as opposed to others. So when you're doing center work like this, you want to try to group students together who are in somewhat similar places, in this case with their use of commas. So if there's kids that have no commas at all in their writing, you would want to be really close to them, right? If there's kids who have commas and they've actually used them mostly pretty much for the most part correctly, you might be a little bit more hands-off with that group. They're still going to get something by moving around. They might end up revising a sentence that they didn't think about earlier. The important thing is you're able to give that immediate feedback that you need to when it comes to coaching the students. So those three methods are, I think, the three most powerful methods in a writing workshop classroom. So we have direct instruction, one example being the mini lesson. We have inquiry and apprenticeship. And those three methods, I think you want to think about not just in writing workshop, but in reading workshop and any content area. That the fact that we can't always be there for every single student, every single step along the way, whether it's in writing, reading, science, or math, we need to set them up to be more directed or self-directed in their own learning. And that will help lead them towards becoming more powerful writers. And not just more powerful writers, but more powerful readers, more powerful mathematicians, and more powerful thinkers. So I want to give you a couple of minutes before we wrap up to go back to those questions that we had at the start. So these are the 3 or 4 questions that I had up. Many of you were thinking about maybe the last one. Some of you were thinking about that second question, perhaps. And I want you to just share with your partner or partners how your thinking has changed around that one question you started thinking about at the very start. So turn and talk. Okay, so I want to share my email I had at the start, and just one last thought before you go. So when it comes to grammar, if you're struggling with this, I was just sharing this with another person in a conversation. If you're struggling with students, with them reading writers who maybe break rules in grammar, right? Poets do that all the time. They break the rules of grammar, right? And they question that, like, why is that happening? I think one thing to say, if you need a little spiel that you can give them or a speech, is to say, you know what? Before you can break rules, you need to know them. And just keeping it as simple as that, right? But also letting them know when you are reading a writer that does take liberties with conventions, letting them know that. So if they're going to be an apprentice to a writer like that, they need to know that they need to think through how the writer's not just using commas, but how they're using them in a different way, right? And think about the meaning of that. So that's just that's like another layer to all of this, but I think it's important to just be frank like that with kids and know that that structure can help them actually become a more powerful writer. So have a wonderful evening, and hopefully I'll see some of you around here tomorrow. Thank you so much. Thanks.